Welcome to episode 35 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero network. This month I had the pleasure of speaking to Kurt Orderson. Kurt is an activist, documentarian, and a revolutionary film director. Orderson has directed many films including The Prodigal Son, Visibly Invisible, The Unseen One, and Not in My Neighborhood, as well as many more. In Not in My Neighborhood, he explores issues of colonialism and gentrification in South Africa, Brazil, and New York. In this episode, Kurt spoke about South Africa, hip-hop, gentrification, internationalism, reimagining liberation, and decolonizing film. Thank you to Awareness for the music, and here's a brief jingle from a fellow Channel Zero network member.
Ransom notes. Anarchist and anti-authoritarian music podcast
that's going to come out every month.
Ransom what?
So what's your ultimate goal, I guess, in this?
Yeah.
We out for the
proletariat.
Rising up against the oppressor.
The attitude that you see in hip-hop.
Let me give you a sample of some of the lyrics that had some of the older ladies among the stockholders white with dismay.
Go to ransomnotes.libsyn.com
or get them from the Channel Zero network.
All right, so to begin, you were born just outside of Cape Town in Mitchell's Plain. And I was wondering if you could share a transformational moment that kind of maybe woke you from propaganda of white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, and when you started working and thinking about issues of justice.
Yeah. No, thank you, Chris, firstly, for inviting me on your show. Really appreciate it. I think to just, talk a little bit more about where I'm from and kind of what shaped my political days and understanding of the world in terms of history and the complexity, obviously, around, coming from a space where, the impact of colonialism is very real, is embedded in the DNA of, South African society. And so, growing up in the periphery of Cape Town, an area, strip of townships known as the Cape Flats. To also explain a little bit of the history, the Cape Flats was created by the apartheid government, right? And so, they had various laws, right, that they passed. It was kind of based on this idea of kind of preserving white supremacy, right? And so there was a housing policy known as the Group Areas Act, right? That kind of was passed during the 1950s, 60s. And so you had black people who were living in the inner city across South Africa, and more specifically in Cape Town. So my family and my father's side had a house in the area called District 6, which I touch on in Not in My Neighborhood. And both actually in Prodigal Son as well, ironically, was where our folks were living. And basically when this law was passed, black people were forcefully evicted out of the inner city, and then the creation of townships basically came about, and this was directly correlated to the apartheid government's Forced Removal Act, basically preserved the inner city as white only, and basically push black people out of the city, and then basically just becoming the labor force who would be shipped into the inner city every day, traveling 20 miles, 30 miles every morning to basically serve the master, whether it is in this kind of large scale factories, from textile to metal to kind of in the context of the kind of industrial capitalism. So Mitchell's Plain as foundation is kind of the space that gave birth to my idea of the world, that shaped my idea and my perception, just in terms of how I see myself, and also just like more importantly, my understanding of civics and my duty, as a citizen. It's a working class community. Both my parents, factory workers. My mom were retrenched actually from the factory because after South Africa signed a deal in early to mid-2000s, basically importing textile goods into South Africa, and that basically crippled the whole textile industry. And this is also in the context of globalization, understanding how global capitalism works. And so my mom, was unfortunately fell victim to one of the laborers who were basically retrenched. And a lot of a lot of colleagues, and these were like, single mothers, single, breadwinners in a household who basically lost their job. So that's a bit of me, and I think what really shaped, my political understanding was, growing up in apartheid, right? When apartheid was crushed, in 1991, when Nelson Mandela released out of prison, I still have vivid memories of that day. I was about like 9 years old, and I remember sitting with my parents in our family home, and watching, this moment, like everyone is sitting on a table around the television. And I didn't really understand the context, but I learned that the significance of Nelson Mandela and what this moment meant of him walking out of Victor Verster, the prison, and where he was kept last, because he was in Robben Island for X amount of years, and he was kind of the last part of his 27 years was in Victor Verster. And I just remember like this moment, of just like a convivial moment for South Africans to finally celebrate, and also finally celebrate a moment of joy for the sacrifices for the liberation movement, right? That whether it's the ANC or the UDF. And I think someone who was key instrumental to this shaping that political gaze and political understanding was my father. He was very politicized. Just his understanding of responsibility and knowing there was a clear enemy, right, which was the apartheid system, and also the fact that the apartheid system also had their spies in our communities, right? So it obviously just like creating a space for thinking, for reading, understanding history, understanding your position in history, and then my sisters, they became active, and they were like actual, young student activists during apartheid. During the end, in fact, they became active during the height of what's known as the state of emergency, which was between the 1985 till the end of officially the end of apartheid, which technically is like 1994, right? When we got our first democratic elections. So it was them and their activist work in the ANC, the African National Congress, as youth activists, that really also gave me an insight of seeing my sisters, seeing the kind of literature they were reading, seeing their activities and their movement. That this kind of sparked the curiosity, as a young kid, not understanding, but they're busy. And then later on, obviously, with the introduction of hip hop, I think hip hop, shifted. It really gave me a clear understanding, right, of the world. That South Africa, for example, was a colony, was a settler, still is perceived as a settler colony, was colonized by the Dutch and then later on by the British. And so just the history, right, and the kind of the colonial iconography that existed in the city of Cape Town. Whenever we would travel to the city, you were bombarded by this colonial iconography and not understanding why are these statues that glorifies these men that don't look like us, right? Kind of with their European gaze and the way the position of these statues were positioned, and then later on understanding, this thing called colonialism, what is it? Oh, South Africa wasn't just the only place colonized. Actually, the whole of Africa was colonized. Actually, the whole world, was colonized by 7, 8 Western nations, European nations, right? And so that, and then it was really hip hop, the kind of the soundscape of my teenage, I think from the age of 14 upwards, was hip hop was the soundscape, of that moment, and it really just opened up my world and just really how I perceive the world, understanding that oppression is something that we have to conquer. We have to collectively work around how do we think to put through the process of collective healing. How do we, resolve issues around intergenerational trauma? What's your positionality as a man? Understanding gender politics. It's just a whole range of ideas that hip hop, the soundscape of hip hop, really opened up. Portals, various portals of engaging in. Let's go. Let's read this book. What is this artist talking about? The history of Khoisan, for example, of the indigenous people of South Africa. It was like bands like Plosy, Prophets of the City, that opened up, that kind of inspired us because it was a local soundscape, right? It was a band, was one of the first hip-hop bands that kind of came out of South Africa, and actually the first official band to blow up internationally in Africa was a band, actually, and some of the founding members are actually from my hood, Mitchells, and many of the other band members were scattered across different townships on the Cape Flats. And it was bands like Black Noise was very foundational, just in terms of, also because we had, introduction to hip hop was, through the Bronx, right? 1970s, Africa Mambata, Kool Herc, etc., and NWA. And so that soundscape directly correlated to our expression, to our separation when NWA was saying, fuck the police. We understood exactly what that meant in the country of South Africa, because this is the height of apartheid, right? Police brutality is a real thing, Communities are being harassed by the police. And so it was just like speaking across the Atlantic, right? That kind of transatlantic conversations, it's happening through music, through art. And ironically, it's interesting also, like, how the apartheid system, government, also how they policed information that was coming into South Africa, right? Literature, books, so literature, music, etc. I remember when Peter Tosh, right, the famous reggae artist from Jamaica, he had, an album, one of his albums, Legalize, and one of the songs on the album is Fight Against Apartheid. And so, for example, that album, when it comes to South Africa, that song would be take off the album, right, before it be allowed in South Africa. So it's just interesting as I came of age, again, give thanks to hip hop, and later on, hip hop also gave me an insight into also like, finding, your spiritual higher being, God consciousness, and I think that would also shape my kind of Pan-African lens, as a Pan-African thinker, and it was really that kind of shaped a lot of my views and understanding of the world.
Thank you for sharing that, Kurt. And just one point on hip hop. We were talking about Ruckus records earlier. I was just listening to Lyricist Lounge 1 again, and wow. that song "Criminals in Action" CIA. The verse from Zach De La Roca, he's talking about Frantz Fanon and Wretched of the Earth. And I remember that's what got me into Frantz Fanon when I was just in high school, because I wanted to know what they were talking about on, Lyricist Lounge.
It's amazing. It's just amazing. Again, like just on like an antidote to share as well, is it was the Roots, the album Things Fall Apart, right?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I was like in grade 11, right, 7, 9, and on my final exams, I was writing my final exams on that album, like being the soundtrack, right. While I was studying, I was listening, because someone, in fact, my sister's ex-boyfriend, shout out to him, he actually brought that album and another album called The Rose at Concrete. Remember the compilation that came out after Tupac got killed, right?
Oh yeah, it had Mos Def on it, and
that whole was a compilation. Mm-hmm. It was a different artist that kind of came. I think Mos Def's song was probably, for me, like one of my favorite, tracks that came out of his album. So he brought me that. He brought that copy, 2 albums back to South Africa and gave it as a gift, And Things Fall Apart. It was years later that I was like, the album title, and then my introduction to Chinua Achebe was through the Roots, for example, right? The famous Nigerian author. And so it was named, then I learned it was named after a book, and then I eventually read the book, right? And so it's amazing, hip-hop as a pedagogy, a different way of educating, and a lot of us are beneficiaries, of that pedagogy, which, is really significant, just from that personal perspective.
Is one of your sisters a political journalist as well?
That's correct.
As far as art, along with hip-hop, was it, I think I've read a story of you being locked outside of your house and you did some wood carving. Is that what had, really sparked the artistic interest in you? Or?
Oh, I'm just curious. I'm like, wow, where are you finding this information? Yeah, you are a researcher, so I'm not going to ask you for your sources, but you research for real. But, yeah, interesting. I mean, when I think about my introduction to art, right, and like, what sparked that interest? I mean, again, as I said, I grew up, during the height of apartheid, and so now I went to a township school, right? With other working class kids, and so obviously the kind of education, the facilities that we had wasn't the greatest, right? So teachers made an effort to spark interest in some of their own educational material that they would share with us, depending on the teacher, right? Again, I'm always emphasize that it's not necessarily about the school and how much school fees it costs to be attended. It's about the educators. And we had an art class teacher in our primary school, or what you guys would call middle school. And I remember just kind of like that space, right, for the art and kind of being opening yourself up to a different, sphere of thinking, tapping into different aspect to your brain, right, the artistic aspect. And so I did wood carving, right. The process back home, so we're 5 kids, right? Me and my 4 sisters. And so not all of us had access to keys, right? Because there was limited amount of keys, so we're all in this household. And so, if I miss or if I didn't communicate, and also this is interesting, it's before cell phones, right? So if no one is there, no one is there. I can't call you on a cell phone, fine. I just have to kind of wait for you, whoever's going to come first, whether it's mom or one of my sisters, right? And so I would jump over the wall, right, my parents' home. And then my father had, some tools in the backyard. And, in fact, ironically, my grandfather, featured in The Prodigal Son, was a carpenter. So it's interesting when one just kind of, makes the connection later in your life as an adult. They're like, oh, why was I interested in wood carving? Oh, because of granddad was wood carving, or he was a carpenter. He was making stuff with wood. And I also learned our great grandfather that we speak about in The Prodigal Son is also into wood carving. It was interesting, and again, people. I don't think people in my community perceive that as an art form, right? Or revered as wow, you can end up doing work and the work might end up in a gallery. That wasn't promoted in where I'm from, right? Art was definitely not promoted. It was very secondary. It was an extramural activity. You are encouraged, to kind of take up the mundane career path, right? You can, start to become a lawyer, or school teacher, or women were encouraged to become a nurse, Doctor was again, there wasn't a lot of black doctors, so that wasn't something that was encouraged. But so it was really that was moments of being by myself. I was the only boy, and so it was that me carving. And I remember, in fact, if I probably go to my parents' home, I was probably still lying there somewhere. But was that really oh wow, that's actually an art form, And I started going to museums as an adult, and I'm like, wow, this is interesting, just reflecting on as when I was a kid, and what was my and obviously then eventually becoming a filmmaker, storyteller. But yeah, that's the story of the wood carving.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Oh yeah, no, definitely.
So I wanted to talk about your film, Not in My Neighborhood.
Yes.
Where you go all over the world through your works, but in that film particularly, you go to Brazil, South Africa, and New York in the U.S.
Yes.
And I was wondering, can you share the importance of internationalism and how you bring that perspective to the art that you make?
Oh yeah, I mean, as I shape my own understanding of the world and just understanding that oppression in South Africa, for example, wasn't necessarily unique just to that geographic location. Oppression, institutionalized oppression, played itself out in various forms across the world, And it was really, my interest to also just, use my work as a medium or as a method or as a tool to think through the ideas around how do we think about global solidarity, right? and to also reach out to other parts of the world, other people, other oppressed people, and to also serve in solidarity to their oppressed and to say, hold up, there's parallels here, to our stories. The kind of geopolitical, tricontinental storytelling that I dabble into is definitely something that, just inspired, organically, again, I'm using pop again as my reference here, and also, through hip-hop, I became, I started following the path of Rastafari, and so I had, all these, international movements and interesting philosophical reasonings and ideologies that was introduced to me, and I started kind of just grabbing, engaging in the material, etc. And then I think as a storyteller and organically my understanding firstly was to also understand how, oppression and global capitalism work and function. And so the issue of gentrification, right, is merely just a microcosm for much more broader discourse around colonialism and globalization, right, and global capitalism, etc. So gentrification was introduced to me, about the word terminology about 11 years ago. I remember, and I was actually reflecting with a friend of mine who we were sitting, in fact, it was actually in New York, right, on 127th Street, across the road from Marcus Garvey Park, right? And we had lunch, right? It was a sunny day, and I saw a graffiti piece that said gentrifiers, get out of my neighborhood. And I asked my homegirl, I said, what does that mean? What is, gentrifiers or gentrification? And she kind of broke it down. She's in New York, right? And so, New Yorkers' introduction to gentrification and understanding what it looks like and feels like, that was already manifesting, was already taking place. And then I started drawing these parallels to South Africa, apartheid spatial planning, and then I learned about redlining, for example, in the U.S., and then I learned about, the formation of favelas and how the favelas came about, and that spoke to how our townships were created in South Africa. I said, hold up, there's all these correlations here. How about, me putting all these stories together and make one cohesive story, right? And allowing these characters who don't know each other speak to each other virtually, right? In the film, kind of designed and orchestrated by me as a storyteller. And also just how do, oppressed people learn new ways of retaliating against global capitalism, against oppression. How do we think about notions around, collective mobilization, intersectionality, of various forms of oppression, various forms of issues? How do we think about it as a cohesive, one kind of attack strategy, Because, what was really amazing about working in Brazil is that you have the intersectionality in a occupied building. You have folks who are thinking about, labor rights, gender rights, landless people's rights, children's rights, the right to education, equal education. And, it was just so fascinating, and not just thinking about, housing rights separated from labor rights. And so it was what can I share from the Brazilian story to the folks from New York, and how can, New York speak to Cape Town, South Africa. It was just creating a narrative for people to learn from each other. That was really it, beyond the artistic approach, to storytelling and filmmaking as a craft. But really, first and foremost, I also perceive myself as an activist as well. Before I'm a film, because I was an activist before I was a filmmaker, and I'm just using my activism, what I've learned through my activist work, and using film as a methodology for social change. And that's really kind of what also inspired this kind of tricontinental storytelling methodology.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and it's just displayed so well in the film. And I wanted to actually, since you were talking about Sao Paulo, you document community meetings and direct actions. And one of the most powerful scenes was in Brazil when we're taking the sledgehammers to the building.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk about that more, and also if you could just speak about what tactics you saw were most effective and what people who are facing the violence of gentrification can do to mobilize from what you learned.
Yeah. For sure. I think I mean, Brazil is such a fascinating country, and I've only spent time in Sao Paulo, in Rio, right? So I think I can really just speak about those two spaces because it's a massive country, right? Big land mass, with like urban, rural narratives of lived experience of what it means to be Brazilian, right? And I think just being in close proximity with these activists in these occupied buildings, in these occupied spaces, it's so refreshing to see how people are reimagining liberation. What the idea of liberation or freedom means. To the working class person from the favelas who want to occupy space also in the inner city because they happen to work, whether it is as cleaners or people, waiters or working at restaurants. And I mean, also I think I learned a lot just being there, about the dictatorship, in the 60s and the 80s, and how that oppressive forms and, police violence and legalized state violence were perpetuated and really violated the lives, of indigenous folks, of Afro-Brazilians, etc., in a massive way. And then you can see, the scars and the aftermath of that trauma, right, and that intergenerational trauma. We spend a lot of time, obviously, in the film, in these occupied buildings. We met, obviously, two characters that you see meet in the film as characters who made it into the film, but we obviously interviewed many other characters, right? There's so much like rich material that I was fighting so hard to kind of like for it to make it into the film, but again, I work with a team, so one had to make some compromises, etc. I mean, but one of the things that kind of stand out for me, we were also there. I mean, during the height of Fora Teme protest, which was basically a protest against the rise of a kind of new dictatorship, which is under the leadership of Temer, right? Temer, who basically came into power after Luna was ousted, So we were just in the thick of things, like every day we were attending a protest. We happened to have a camera, so the camera was rolling, but I was just like so fascinated just being in the protest because it was just like a kind of sense of conviviality, Like people were like, a protest was a party as well, right? It was, obviously it was folks, it was the kind of gender activists, it was the labor movement, it was the housing activists, it was, the landless people's movement. Everyone is there, right? Chanting Fora Teme, out with Temer. And, obviously, we were also shooting a film, so we were like, engaging, asking Vox Pop, tell me your story, where you from? Oh, no, like we from this movement. And so you learn, obviously we were learning about various intersectionality in different movements that was kind of participating, against, this collective oppression, this force that was oppressing the citizens of Brazil, but Brazilians saying, we also have the power, we have people power, It was so refreshing. I think also being in those occupied spaces, for example, in Prestes Maya, which is one of the oldest occupied buildings in Latin America, was I was curious about what was the introduction to a lot of activists and occupants who were living in the building, like how were they introduced to the space? And so people were sharing stories with us, about when they came to the building, they had no idea of politics, of political activism, civics, rights, etc. And was through the to living in this occupied building, there was a political schooling happening at the same time, right? Communities will have like gatherings every Monday, talking about the building, like, okay, cool, like, who has responsibilities for cleaning this week, let's open up some business opportunities for young people in the building. Let's, create, carpentry or like tiling initiatives, trainings. But then also there's a political school about Marxism, right? About landless people's movements across the world. What can activists in Brazil learn about, landless movements across the world? What can we learn about indigenous people's rights in North America or Canada or in Africa, or in specifically South Africa, etc. And it was just an amazing opportunity to also share my own lived experience, right? Coming from South Africa, coming from a space that's very similar to Brazil, I mean, Brazil and South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world, So there's parallels. And I think more importantly, the connection even to Brazil for us in the film was consecutively the FIFA Soccer World Cup hosted in South Africa in 2010, and in 2014 it was hosted in Brazil, and we saw exactly this similar, the kind of legalized state violence was happening, the kind of evictions that was taking place. So we drew a lot of parallels and correlations between Brazil and South Africa. It was just amazing for me to also say stories about South Africa, and stories also about like having lived in the US, and stories that I've learned here. Yeah, I think film has also become an institution for a lot of us, and we learn about. I learned about like urban planning, architecture, urban policy. How does urban policies get structured? Who passes these urban policies? What's the right to fair housing, affordable housing? How does civil society fight for rent control? All these ideas, and it was just like really amazing how Brazilians were thinking about all of these ideas under the auspices and ideas about collective idea around liberation and freedom and independence at the same time, and self-governance and self-reliance. Because I see these occupied spaces as run by proletariat, and this collective, the idea around collective security, collective responsibility as well, that we have responsibility. I have responsibility for you and your well-being. There's a concept of Ubuntu, right? That we speak in South Africa, which is a Zulu term, which is I am me because of you. And it is this idea of reciprocity. Each one teach many, each one teach one, And so, yeah, that was my experience in Brazil. And it also speaks across the board with the US and South Africa.
Wow, thank you so much for digging into that and breaking it open more.
Yeah, man.
And yeah, the horizontal kind of organizing and the non-hierarchy, it sounds so inspiring, and it reminds me a lot of reading about the Zapatistas and some other even anarchist organizing spaces as well.
I was definitely. I think I take a lot of my ideas around kind of breaking this notion around horizontal leadership, and trickle down leadership methods that very much driven by Western hegemony, And it was a Zapatista movement, and it really kind of like a brain scattering moment. I was like, wow, like this is it sounds like just so like a mythical idea, But in fact, then I learned it was made into a reality in Chiapas, right, in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And just all these movements, these so-called fringe movements, that just it should be popularized, as part of popular culture, because it's possible, And I think people are thinking a little bit more about it, even during this moment of dealing with the pandemic. How do we, because clearly capitalism, this idea of how extraction, capitalist, forms of extraction and capitalism, as in the context of globalization, and that the 1% need to rule, have a monopoly over economics, We need to rethink this whole social structure that we've been dealing with, over the last, 2 centuries, right? And so I think people are thinking a little bit more about what's the Zeitgeist moment for reimagining a new society.
Definitely. Thanks, Kurt. Staying on the Not in My Neighborhood film, I had a question about what were some powerful moments that you had to cut in editing, and if you'd like to share, bring some light to those stories. I know you kind of mentioned some parts.
Oh yeah, I mean there's so many, a lot to mention, I think editing a film is a very crude, crude process, because you have to fly material that's as equivalent, as powerful as the scene that you're going with, right? It's very objective as well, and it kind of spur of the moment of oh, that sequence speaks to that one, and then so okay, cool, let's move with this, let's go with this, because you remember, obviously we shot the film over 4 years, so we sat with hours and hours of material. So imagine sitting with a 8 terabyte hard drive with over possibly 100 hours of material, right?
Oh wow!
To basically cut an 86-minute film. I mean, just imagine that process. I mean, you are a writer, you dabble in media, when you're sitting with this 2-hour interview, what do you have to do? How do you cut this thing for 20 minutes, right? So there was various moments where I was, basically going head to head with my editor or my producers, And so I think, some of the moments that stood out in specifically in South Africa, I think it was we were interviewing, characters in this occupied horse stable. Homeless people were occupying a horse, literally a horse stable, and so they, basically turned these horse stables into one-bedroom homes, basically. And I spent a large amount of time in the horse stables, and then they occupied another space underneath a highway, right? Community, basically, homeless people. A lot of people, ironically, became homeless because of gentrification. People who grew up in areas like Woodstock and Selma, in the form, and different areas around South Africa, around Cape Town as well. And these are also people who were, somewhat of a wrong legacy because of forceful eviction that happened because of the Group Years Act, etc. And so the horse stable sequence, I had a character actually in the horse stable. I followed for a few months, and I just felt so attached to her story, and I really this seems to be in the film. And her name is Ursula. And we have some amazing material, and that example didn't end up in the film, right? She had this amazing story about growing up in Woodstock and being evicted, and her family, her mom and dad, her mom dying, her father losing the house, and the siblings being scattered around Cape Town, and her, being forced into prostitution, just so much, material and personal, shared a lot of personal stories, about her life. And it was really difficult, to let go of her story, and for it to not, unfortunately, fit into the narrative or the arc of the story. And there was this other character who were occupying a space just down the road from the horse stables. This guy, worked as a seaman, right? And he worked for a multinational corporation called Chef Marine. I think they're either Swedish or German, right? And they had the monopoly, of the maritime capitalism for the longest time. They have subsidiaries across the world. And he worked, a lot of the workforce were black men from South Africa, ironically, who ended up on these ships, and they would travel around the world. And this guy, literally, he could speak 7 languages, right? Living under the bridge, homeless, traveled across the world. He was telling me stories about, being in San Francisco, in the 80s, going to Japan, China, Indonesia, ending up in Hong Kong, ending up in Europe, Norway, Holland, crazy stories. But you could speak Mandarin, could speak Japanese, could speak local dialects of Indonesia. It was just mind blowing. And I actually have this material, I have this speech, and that, for example, it didn't make it into the film, In New York, for example, there's so much stories. In New York, there was, in the early phase of, shooting, we had, these amazing stops, and I think our idea is to democratize media, and so, my work in my activism work in teaching filmmaking in the townships in South Africa, teaching it, in working class communities here in the US, in the favelas, going to various spaces and sharing the craft. And because I believe that, I think everyone has a story, and one would like to make a film. So how do we, decolonize, the filmmaking process and to make it a little more accessible, democratize it. So that's really some of the stories about that was unfortunately didn't make it into the film.
They they could be films on their own, each story.
Oh, yes. I agree 100%. In fact, Chris, a side note, a lot of the footage that didn't make into the film, we ironically last summer, we ended up doing an online exhibition. the virtual exhibition titled Chronicles of Spatial Violence. And it ended up, we basically launched it. It was supposed to be a launch that was an exhibition that was going to do, it was like a mobile exhibition that was going to travel around Baltimore, where I'm based. And it was part of my, it was designed, kind of came out of my residency I did at Johns Hopkins University. And that ended up online, so you can actually watch it. It's accessible on Instagram. We launched it through Instagram page, so if you go to Not In My Neighborhood, the Instagram page on Instagram, all the episodes, so we basically, it became a 20-part series of like short 2 to 5 minute interviews, and a lot of the characters and interviews and making into the 86-minute film ended up as part of the exhibition. It's also available on YouTube as well. So, yeah, if you want to check it out as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I'll link that in the show notes for the podcast.
That's amazing, for sure.
Well, my next question ties back to an earlier film you did, Prodigal Son.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could share the experience that you talked about with the solidarity with indigenous people when you attended a powwow in Baltimore, yes, and the connections you made.
Yeah. No, most definitely. I lived prior to going to the Caribbean. I actually worked in Baltimore and New Jersey back in 2006, right? I came here for a year, and I worked as part of an educational program at this NGO in like East Baltimore, working basically with young working class youth, basically teaching them media skills, kind of visual arts in its broader sense, but also like engaging with my work and sharing my work around storytelling and storytelling methodologies for these young kids. And we made use of few films together. These were like 12 to like 15-year-old kids. It was so exciting, and also like being in the U.S. for the first time, right? Kind of like breaking all these notions of like kind of Hollywood's perception about America, the kind of classification, of like everyone in America lives in Beverly Hills, right? Because that's what was sold to us, what we bought into, in the rest of the world as Hollywood was exporting its work, to the rest of the world, and how we were perceiving in South Africa, the U.S. And so being in Baltimore, obviously one of the most unequal, cities in the U.S., underfunded, the infrastructure is lacking, etc. And also a space where redlining, ideas of redlining was the experimentation of whether redlining would work, was the experimental grounds were Baltimore, right? And segregation, etc. So I was attending, in fact, with my ex-girlfriend. They took, family took us to a powwow for the first, and Mom was like, "Yo, you need to come check out this powwow," and their personal genealogy, they had a connection to the Lenape and Cherokee people, and they were also African descent as well. So they have an interesting kind of and a nuanced hybrid identity, and how they're embracing both the African identity and the indigenous identity. That was also like a kind of eye-opener for me, right? Also the kind of idea of the indigenous person, there's also this kind of very much one-dimensional personification or iconography that was presented to us, outside of the U.S. So I learned there's so much like the diversity of indigenous people, at this power, and just like I was just like in awe, like seeing the power and kind of going into a trance mode while the dancers, were going into a trance. I was kind of losing myself, and I had a camera, I was filming all this amazing material, and it was, my one of my editorial advisors who actually were like told me, who kind of made a connection. I was like, wow, I didn't make that connection in the moment. I just had this kind of natural, organic connection. It's because of, like my own ancestral, connection to, being descendant of the Korean descent, from both the mom and dad side, And so the downbeat, the trance, understand it, how big the trance dance is in specifically fan position, when people, are kind of teleporting, having an out-of-body experience, the fire, the drum, the dance, and just the kind of mystic energy, the rock art, for example, I learned obviously later on the connection between indigenous rock art with Native Americans and with indigenous my ancestors, right, in Southern Africa. And so it was the editorial advisor was like, yo, there's a connection here. We should write this in the script, right? He actually wrote that line. And so later on, obviously, these films live with you, and you every time you watch it or just listening to you, like referring to it like, oh, wow, like I haven't been thinking about this, but it kind of just opens up new portals of thinking about that moment, what that moment actually meant 14 years ago, right? You must remember, this is like, I shot that scene in 2006, right? What are we talking about? Like, I don't know how many years ago, like 15 years ago, right? And how relevant it is still in this moment, right? As I'm still coming of age and as I'm still learning about just interconnection with indigenous people around the world. Yeah, so it was really that, that my own personal connection to my own ancestral journey and making that connection to indigenous people. And that journey has grown, just like with my work, with solidarity work, with Standing Rock, a few years ago. And because when we were forming up in my neighborhood, that was also happening at the same time. So a few of our characters in the film were actually in Standing Rock, went Standing Rock, they were in solidarity with the world. In fact, Kim Cortez, one of our characters in the New York segment, who lives in Harlem, were kind of, were in the front line in Standing Rock. And I remember her coming back from Standing Rock, and we were interviewing her a few days later, and she was just like, oh, listen, meet me here, come out. There's a protest happening at, like, a central station in New York City, in Manhattan. I went, met some of the other activists. There was a big protest in solidarity with Standing Rock. And so, my work continued, just make these connections and building solidarity through using cinema, as our weapon, for social change and building solidarity across colonial borders,
Thank you for sharing that. So I wanted to ask you about the concept of decolonization,
yes.
What the concept means to you. You've also used it in the concept of film.
Yes.
If you could just kind of elaborate more on those terms.
Yeah, the articulation, and the definition of what decolonization means. It varies. Obviously, you can have an academic terminology, of what it means, but also you can have a personal lived experience idea of what that actually means, that the idea of decolonization. And as for us in South Africa, it was very much popularized, just with the movement in the 60s, with the anti-colonial and decolonial movement, it was happening across the continent. And South Africa being one of the last countries to be decolonized, when apartheid was abolished, when the kind of, settler colonial rule ended and the British rule. But still, obviously, that's a whole other story, right? Like, what does neocolonialism means in the present moment, right? What, like, extraction, capitalism, etc. And so, I have a very personal, connection or idea around what that means. And I'm also referring to the work, we did around Trees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall in South Africa. And I'm not sure if you're familiar or, some of your listeners. Mm-hmm. But it was really, during 2014, 2015, students from the University of Cape Town basically, started speaking out, that to fight for equal education, equal rights, but also equal education and free education, free and decolonial education. And the movement got galvanized, second, third time around, because we've been in growing up in a place like Cape Town or South Africa, you are bombarded by, like just colonial iconography, right? The statues of citizens on roads, Queen Elizabeth right in front of Parliament, Jan Smuts, who was this like Afrikaner nationalist general, basically, who were like massacring people across southern Africa. And the Rhodes statue specifically on campus at UCT, and young students were basically saying, this still represents oppression, and we have to remove these statues, because for us to really process this idea of what does healing look like, 25 years after democracy in South Africa, we can start with removing statues and decolonizing our education curriculum. One, start deeply thinking about, like these ideas that we've been talking about decolonization in a place like South Africa, moving away from, Roman Dutch laws, that's called the Constitution in South Africa. Land reform, speak directly to decolonization, right? And why is it that, a small amount of white farmers still own, 85% of agricultural land, the largest exporters of wine, for example, come out of these, like, wine farms that's been passed down, generationally through the lineage of, white Afrikaners and white English, British descendants, So, I've been working on land rights activism work, the land reform. So these ideas of decolonization are very good because when I start making decolonizing land reform, it's about my family, my own family, my grandfather, my mother's side was a farm worker, right? I'm away from the plantation, literally, to basically seek refuge in the city, the urban cities of Cape Town, for example, and he was from like the rural, towns in the Western Cape. My mom's side, my grandmother, for example, they lived in Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch was anonymously known for when the height of slavery in South Africa, which was abolished, in 1850s, ironically just before emancipation happened here in the U.S. And so, colonization was very real. It's like, we inherit, my family inherited that legacy. And so, as a young Rastafari youth, and Rastafari spoke directly against oppression, colonization, and the idea of solidarity, Pan-African solidarity, fighting against apartheid, fighting oppression, with like this music coming out of the West from the Caribbean, hip-hop soundscapes kind of coming out of the U.S. And so, that really shaped my idea around decolonization, that it was personal, that, I need to understand these various forms of oppression, somehow, decolonize the legacy of where it is, the role of ethnographic cinema and anthropological cinema, how these Europeans were gazing and looking at, like, studying indigenous people across the world and making them and kind of creating this caricature, stereotypical image that was perpetuated, still being perpetuated today, still in kind of mainstream media. And so it was really like I was looking at like the tools I have access to, which is film, right? And then using my films as a methodology for decolonization. But also decolonizing my own mind, right? I think about Frans Fanon, when I think about Malcolm X, the work of Ngoki, the famous author of Kenya, but Francis Cress Wilson, for example, a book that was very instrumental in my decolonial process was the ISIS Papers, for example, right? RIP, rest in power to Dr. Francis Cress Wilson, who was from the US. So the ISIS Papers was like just a key instrument, a piece of literature for a lot of the young African people, were seekers of knowledge, specifically in South Africa. It was that kind of literature, it was that kind of music, it was hip-hop, it was reggae, African literature that we were reading. It really shaped my idea around, thinking about decolonization in a nuanced way. As an urban African, as a kid who grew up in an urban idea of Africa, and also reshaping what is the kind of new Africa that we're also creating. But it's a new forms of African diaspora that we're creating as well, right? Because the key about, also what I call solidarity is also how do we build also solidarity with African people across the world. So, for example, Visibly Invisible speaks about that, the Prodigal Son speaks about that, and also Not in My Neighborhood. Yeah, so, decolonization for me, a reference to it is my personal family's history, as a people were colonized, but also we have recaptured our own imaginary using the tools that, we inherited from the oppressor, but to make it, flip it and to decolonize that same process to make it our own now, creating our own body of work, our own archive, right? That we can become custodians of our own stories.
Definitely, and your art is a liberatory archive. That's what I love about it. It's powerful, it's inspiring, and it's just important work. My last question was about where people could find your work, and if you could speak more about Azania Rising Productions and the importance of storytelling about Africa's legacy and agency regarding political consciousness.
Obviously people can find me, on the streets of Google, .com. We visible, we on YouTube, all different platforms, Twitter, Instagram. I think we're lacking on Facebook. We kind of just even moving away from Facebook for obvious reasons, I think, I personally, I must be, I'm not, this is the most active person on social media. I just found myself being too busy, when I have to play, dabble in social media. As when I actually have a moment, right now, I'm kind of having a moment, with like Instagram, not really that active. The only platform I really interact with right now is Twitter. But I'm not active necessarily like posting stuff. But on Google, people can find my work we have a YouTube, we have a channel called Azania Rising Productions. All our work is on there. There's more stuff that's being uploaded. We have a Vimeo channel. Unfortunately, a lot of our new work is private. It's not accessible because, again, dealing with these like capitalists, distributors, we try to kind of like get these deals and like hopefully make some money so we can make another film. But the work is available on various platforms. If they Google either my name or Azania Rising Productions, they'll be, guided, through to our work. Yeah, and I think Azania Rising, obviously, we were formed and we were highly inspired by the legacy of third cinema, people like Haile Garima, people like Samben, we inspired by Asian cinema, we inspired by Latin America, we inspired by Augustus Puyol, the author of The Theatre of the Oppressed. And so we just highly inspired by, just other, communities, who have inherited the legacy of oppression and who are decolonizing, these oppressive modes of whether it's ideologically or how notions of democracies functions in whether it's Latin America, and learning from how activists are taking back their rights through Bolsonaro's oppressive regimes in Brazil. So Azania Rising, really the formation of it is to decolonize the Western gaze of how we think about African people, and also for us to be our own authors, our own griots, our own orators of our own story, and controlling our own and controlling our own archive, and owning our own archive, and also building solidarity. I think that's the reason why Azania Rising was formed. Realized that we want to be a platform to speak across geographical borders, across continents, and building solidarity, and also democratizing media, allowing young people from these different corners of the world to also allow them to tell their own stories and to connect with other filmmakers from across different parts of the world, right? Mm-hmm. Because I believe, this notion, this divide between global south, global north is all based on myths, it's all based on westernized hegemony of, who has the dominant power over popular culture, or who's the driving of, how culture should be shared, and also just like technology as well, right? Like I'm really interested in like how do we democratize technology, the internet, for example. How do we build new ways of communicating with each other? And that's really the emphasis why Gentrification was formed as a vehicle to build bridges, throughout the world.
That's awesome. Just sharing resources and building. It just definitely comes through all your work. So
thank you so much. Thank
you so much, Kurt.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. I want to thank Kurt Orderson for taking the time to speak with me. Please support his work and films. Thank you to Awareness for the music. I'm not going to ask people to support, share, or rate my show or join Patreon, but to do all that for other podcasts that are part of the Channel Zero Network. See you next time.